If you're enjoying the Health Geeks Book Club podcast, we'd appreciate if you hit the subscribe button, leave a like, rating, or review, whichever your preferred podcatcher platform allows. Welcome to the Health Geeks Book Club podcast. Listen in as Kristen Norton and Eleanor Russell review all those great health and wellness books you've been wanting to read or you have read and want to talk about. Here's Kristen and Eleanor.
Well, it's a Health Geeks podcast time again, and we're gathered around in the new studio this month. We're having a good time, and Kristen Norton is with me, as we always are together with Tim Beeman. But today we have with us Bob Carr, and he has joined us because I invited him. I said, way back in our history, we did some personality inventories with some medical students and personnel in the medical school, and we've enjoyed lots of good conversations over the years about interactions and relationships and how the world functions. So this book called The Modern Enneagram came into our wellness wheel constellation because we were looking at relationships. Healthy, part of our health is based on the relationships we have. And so this book is called The Modern Enneagram, Discover Who You Are and Who You Can Be. And it's written by Kacie, Berghoef, and Melanie Bell, and they are at the Enneagram Institute. They're authorized teachers and workshop leaders. They're based in California, and it seems like they've been doing this for several years. But this particular discourse was published in 2017. So while Bob and I have been talking about personality typing for over 20 years or more, they're still talking about it. So I'm going to kind of open it up with a quote in here. There's a quote where they talk about many people describe a feeling of sense of relief when they find their Enneagram type, as they finally have an explanation for why they keep getting caught in the same traps. And so, what does it mean to have your personality typed? And do you all out there in podcast land know your Enneagram type? Or
I don't know, but there's certain, I can relate to that because when I learn about myself through one of these types of tools, I'm always like, oh, it all makes sense now, and I'm not crazy, or, I'm not the only one. So I think it can give a sense of, okay, like putting the puzzle together a little bit, and I can understand. And I think there's a negative part of it too, because it can call out your struggles, and it can bring up some negative feelings about what your personality type might be. So,
well, what is the Enneagram? Do you know anything about the history, Bob, of the Enneagrams and how? Because this is not a new thing.
No, it's not. The history of the Enneagram is really shaded in a lot of mystery. Mm-hmm. Some would put it back to the 2500 BC.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was kind of old.
Yeah, for the roots of it. But the modern Enneagram probably dates back to the 14th century, the Sufi, a sect of Islam, the holy men or the shaman group, and very closely associated with mathematics at the time. They were Islam was very much into mathematics.
And numerology.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And so the number 9, which is the meaning of Enneagram, means 9.
Oh,
good
to know.
Of 9. Okay. It really stems from that. Our experience with it really jumps up to about 1920, when a German shaman, some would call him a charlatan, mm-hmm. some would call him a wonder worker, mm-hmm. He discovered some of the teachings of these Sufis and incorporated some of that into his training. That was then further developed probably in the 1920s, mm-hmm. when the first iterations of it, so to speak, came down to us. Then it jumps really from the 20s to about 1950, 1960. And I was trying to remember where I first came in touch with it. but it turned out, just a little bit of my background.
Yeah, share that.
It.
Please do.
The roots of this have a very strong spiritual aspect, not necessarily religious, but spiritual aspect. And the folks who really developed this to where it is today are really a group of religious Jesuits. And back in the 60s, if you remember that,
I can.
Somebody says if you can remember where you were, you weren't there. But in the 60s, I was in a religious school, a seminary. And then in 1970, I was out in Berkeley, California. And then after 71, I was in Toronto, Canada. Now, each of these, turns out, as I was looking into the history of this, were significant places where the Enneagram was further developed.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting on that. So the history that we have, it is shrouded in mystery, to admit that, but it also has definite paths. 1920, 1950, 19...
Sort of influences on it.
Yeah. And the ones who really brought it out into the American population was Riso and Palmer.
And they refer to them in this book.
Yeah, and the brief history that she touches on here. And I had lost sight of this. I had delved into it back in the 80s. Perhaps it was 90s, or it could have been later. But as I say, my path passed over and through some of those significant areas of development.
So the person, in the Enneagram, there are the 9 points, and they call it, now it's the Enneagram today is a personality system, and not so much the, like Richard Rohr, and you have another one here. Is that Helen Palmer, the Sacred Enneagram? No,
this is a more recent author, Christopher Hurwitz.
Oh, okay. So the value, like Kristen Norton was saying, about when you study yourself and look at your own thing, and then it explains things to you. I have done the INQ with you. I've done the Myers-Briggs with you. I've done Strength Finders. I've done Color Code. I'm yellow, which I don't understand in context with the other ones that I do. And I've done, in town we have Paul White, is that his name, that does the love languages?
That I'm not familiar with.
No. Well, that's another, the languages of love and affection.
Chapman,
thank
Gary
you.
Chapman.
Gary Chapman, thank you. I don't know how to get that other name out. But anyway, so if you start doing all of these, you could just spend a whole lot of time, coloring yourself. And what does that do for us? Really, I'm asking that because we're talking about defining ourselves on the Enneagram scale, and their wings and arrows and... What do we make of this, y'all? How do we use it?
Well, again, let me go back and part of my background. When I was in training, the Greek philosophers, the ancient philosophers, and one of them, Thales, was famous for the statement, know yourself. Socrates, one of his students, came along and said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So I think... whether you go back to 2500 BC or the Greek, I think the idea of getting to know yourself, the fundamental question is, who am I? And from that comes the question of, why am I here? And where am I going? So questions which roll out of that. But fundamentally, it comes down to, who am I? And the sad fact is that most of us don't have a clue.
So if we stopped ourselves and did some practice like this, we might have a little more insight. Is that maybe a recommendation? And
would you say that that's a sense of spiritual wellness, that we could get to know ourselves as a person? Trying to categorize it in the wellness wheel.
Yeah, but I think it's it'd even be physical, because once you are calm or you know yourself and you can reduce inner conflict, your physiology is going to be healthier too. Your brain is going to feel better. You might not be in as much stress because of the conflicts. I thought you were going to talk about in the human resource area, where people are or at work, because in here they do split out. They give you you go somewhere else to get your type. You don't do it in this book. I had to go online, and I did a free one. Did you?
I did a free one, and it also says that you could take a test, or some people just recommend reading through. And she says, in some cases, the Enneagram test will indicate one type for you, but you may identify more strongly with a different type after reading the descriptions. No Enneagram test is completely accurate, and self-recognition is the best way to find your type.
Yeah. Well, when we were talking about unwinding anxiety in another book we read, we talked about comfort and danger, and the space between that is growth. And one of the things I think these authors talk about is knowing how to observe yourself from the inside. That self-awareness allows growth. You can't grow until you know where you are to know where you're going, I guess.
Yeah, there is no self-growth without self-observation, self-understanding. So, yeah, I would... The descriptions that she gives are just a small portion of what the Enneagram has developed. So reading this,
you wanted
give you
more
some hints.
You wanted more.
Yeah. A few generalities. You can say, "Well, I'm like that," but then when you start getting more specific, you find a lot more information. I was reminded, or an analogy that may come from our backgrounds. It's like going to a doctor's office. You can have a physical exam done, and you'll get certain information about yourself. But then you may have diagnostic tools. You may have x-rays, you may have blood work, you may have PET scans, MRIs, whatever. Each one is going to give you, even though it's picturing the same person, it's going to give you greater depth of understanding. So I would say, not in a negative sense, but I'd say this is superficial. In the sense it's just touching the surface of something that has the book.
So maybe a starting place to say, if I like this, I need to go deeper. There's more, better. You'll enjoy even.
I think the wealth of information that can be gained from pursuing and using a tool like that, and it is a tool. To go back to my analogy for a moment, the doctor could show me the x-ray and I wouldn't have a clue what he's talking about. Unless you have some further knowledge and greater understanding of the use of those tools. The authors here bring out that the process of self-discovery is difficult and lonely. And it makes sense for you to work together with a friend, a group, study group, others who can help you assist. Because very often, I'll go back to what you were referring to earlier, we don't usually like to look at the negative side. We like to know all those positive things. And the other danger, I think, is trying to pigeonhole other people. And if you take just a superficial glance at someone and say, oh, you're a 3, you're a 5, you're a 7, whatever, doesn't do you any good at all. So I would put it in as in 3 stages. One is just to know yourself through observation and through study. And this is one method, and one very excellent method of that. The second level is, what do you do with that?
Exactly. And that's where I feel they always truncate these things. You get that Myers-Briggs score and you know, okay, I'm a EFNTJ or whatever. And that's it. You walk out the door. Yeah. And then there's no one to continue that. So I think you're right about supporting yourself if you decide to become self-aware. You can't do it just alone.
And I've also heard, though, that the Enneagram is private, that people don't like to talk about their types or shouldn't. So do you feel like... Because that I get, and it would make sense to work through, but I've heard at the same time that other people believe Enneagrams shouldn't be just outright asked, like, what's your Enneagram type?
Well, I'd almost compare it to New Year's resolutions. Somebody says if you make a resolution, keep it to yourself. Others would say if you have friends who would support you, share it with them.
Because if you announce it, you're more likely to do it. Yeah, there's 2 schools of thought on that.
Yeah. But the second stage, if I go back for a moment, would be the acceptance. Now that I know this about myself, the good, the bad, and the ugly, can I accept that myself? If not, I have all kinds of defense mechanisms that can block out that, overlook it, neglect it, whatever. And the third stage is to improve yourself. Now that I know this, now that I have accepted this, where do I move on to?
Which is what she was saying. You can understand how you can get unstuck because you may have been doing things not aware of why you're getting the results or the difficult relationships. And once you know, you can say, oh, well, maybe I can do that differently. Maybe I can learn something.
Yeah, that was what I would refer to on the first level of observing and understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And for many people, that can be very difficult. As she says, it's a lonely process. It's a difficult process.
Well, what about these three centers, the mind, the gut, the heart?
And the gut.
Yeah, mind, heart, gut, exactly. Do you work on those separately?
You were referring to wellness. And wellness, I would say, is wholeness or balance.
Oh, I like that.
I like that too.
Yeah.
And the Enneagram is about balancing those three centers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's knowing not only who you are, why you do the things you do, how you interact with other people, how your formative experiences, especially in your childhood, have impacted you. So once you take all of that together, I'm not as bad as some people have made me out to be, okay? Nor am I as good as I think I am.
That's right, yeah.
So it's a question of how do I balance all of these different forces and experiences in my life. And so from that point of view, wholeness, balance, health, good health, I would say all three are intimately connected.
And using a tool to help you do that's not a bad idea.
No.
Yeah.
You have to start somewhere.
Right. Kristen, do you have a thing you want to focus on?
I just think we haven't really talked about the Enneagram types that, according to this book, says are motivated by different core desires and use different strategies to meet those desires. So that's kind of what you get when you look at your Enneagram type. And I'm curious if there's like a quick review we could do for the listeners of the 9 types without going in depth.
Yeah. It depends on if you're talking about on the job or, because I have a couple of lists of the ways that they went about teasing them out. Like the empathetic connector at work, they might be in the healthcare business. But then you find a whole lot of other types might be in the healthcare business too. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't really just universal, like this group is an aptitude for this kind of profession.
That was one thing I appreciated in this book.
Okay.
Her emphasis on you will find all of these types in every profession.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And you can have very successful people with various types in those professions. And I think that's important to realize because, because I'm good at math means I'm going to be a...
type 2.
That kind of thing, yeah. But what the authors encouraged is look at what motivates people in those professions.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that you're doing this because it's a good thing to do? Is it because you get kudos for it?
Power,
yeah. Money, prestige. So what is your motivation? Now, because I'm in this profession, let's say healthcare, doesn't mean I love people.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
And once you see a pattern of behavior, you can begin to understand why this person is compatible with me, why I can't stand this person's guts. This one always irritates me. Aren't we the same? No, we're very different.
But also knowing why they irritate you, then you know how to approach them, maybe.
That would be a
higher level.
Yeah, trying to find out to say it. Get your own act together first, okay? And that's the danger here, I think, of trying to type people. That once I learn a little bit about myself, I want to know about you. And typing people, putting them in that little box hole so I can control them is basically why we do that. It's not helpful.
Wow.
So that's interesting because you said you use this a little bit in human resources. So it's a tool to self-discovery, but also something we can use to interact with other people. So how do we tiptoe around the sensitivity issue of it, right? Like we don't want to put somebody in a box or type somebody out, but we also want to understand how to work with them better. So how do you do that in a way that's not offensive?
Well, let's do what you just said. Type 1 is, in general, seeking integrity. That's the primary motivator. Type 2, primary motivator is connection. Type 3 is value. Type 4 is identity. Type 5 is clarity. Type 6 is guidance. Type 7 is freedom. Type 8 is power. And type 9 is harmony. So if that's a primary motivator, which is certainly colored by those wings and arrows, so it's not just total power. But if you know you're going to interact with someone who is power motivated primarily, you're going to need to talk in that ballpark, or they're not going to hear you, maybe.
Right. I'm just curious though, like if you were to use this in human resources the way like Strength Finders or Myers-Briggs can sometimes be used, then how do you share within employees your types without those assumptions and boxing of people? Like I'm just trying to figure it out.
Let me give you a real life experience.
Okay.
In the Human Resource Department, when we were with Bowman Gray School of Medicine, this goes back a little while, we were looking for a second in charge, a person who would work directly with, I won't mention his name here right now.
Yeah, it's going to be broadcast internationally, you know. Okay. Just let me remind you that.
We were interviewing, and our boss said, I want somebody who basically would be like me, who could crunch the numbers and be excellent with people. Mm-hmm. And he was one who favored the crunching the numbers. Mm-hmm. Okay. We had somebody who came from another part of the hospital complex, highly qualified, an excellent candidate, could have done the job very well. Recognizing I used a different instrument, but basically you could have discovered it from this as well. I discovered that she was more people-oriented than numbers-oriented. And in the process of my interviewing with her, I asked her, I said, now, the job is defined as both. I suspect that if you come on board, you would be more oriented towards the people, and the boss wants you more oriented towards numbers. She acknowledged that and appreciated my sharing that with her. And this saved her making I think a critical career choice. She returned to where she was and was much happier.
That's a good example.
Mm-hmm.
So, but again, it's you don't do that on a surface level. It's when you're able to. So I would encourage people pursue more deeply.
Yes.
For yourself, first of all. And I think that's the basis of it, knowing yourself. It's back to that.
We're reading that in a lot of these books, particularly in the psychology area, of learning to enhancing your self-awareness skills is a good thing.
Yeah. I like about the Enneagram that isn't present that I'm aware of in other personality types is that you've got your healthy type 1, your average type 1, and your unhealthy.
That was cool.
Right.
Yeah, so you can see, all right, when I'm at my best, this is what I look like. When I'm really struggling, this is what it looks like. And, it kind of leaves that room for growth, which is kind of neat.
Mm-hmm. Another way of looking at that would be there's a continuum. And if I am a 6, for example, I may be a healthy 6. I may move more towards the average. Or the unhealthy.
And
so
it could
saying I'm a 6 doesn't tell me enough.
Right.
So going into where they refer to that continuum is an important element.
Yeah, so like that gal who was considering a job change, if she had chosen to do that, put her in an environment where the pressures were for her to be more of what she wasn't, then her unhealthy characteristics may have surfaced. And I think that's what I know. I personally found that in my careers is when I was unhappy with what I was doing, instead of paying attention to it, I stayed. And you could learn a lot and save yourself a lot of anxiety and better health to say, this isn't feeling really good. And why? Because this is who I am and this is what they're requiring of me. I need to change. And I think that would have been great for me earlier.
Yeah.
And lots of people maybe. And, so many people are afraid to do that. I think particularly the 30 and 40-year-olds, once they have done their first foray out into the working world and maybe what they call the golden handcuff thing, they get a job, they do it well, they don't like it, but they're afraid to leave because they have the benefits, they have this and that. And so that fear comes in, and then that probably pushes them into a more unhealthy dimension of their characteristics.
While you were just saying that, I was reminded, Gail Sheehy, I think, was the author of Passages, perhaps?
I remember that name.
But she mentioned that most folks in this country here, about the age 18, are lined up into a career, and
they're too young.
They get stuck, yeah. Basically. And at that age, most people have not taken enough time, study, to get to know who they are. They can do all kinds of other wonderful things, but for self-awareness, most have not
had any opportunity to explore that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's changing a little bit with the younger generations. That you are expected to work several jobs in your lifetime and be able to kind of reinvent yourself as you figure out life and yourself a little more. And in fact, I got that a little bit from following Mel Robbins. She really encourages you to not get stuck in that and do what you're passionate about, even if that's reinventing her. She's reinvented herself a lot of times. So she's a good example of that. Can we talk a little bit about the wings? Can someone explain what the wings are?
Not me. Yes, wings are one and arrows are the other.
Okay, you might say it's like my right and left hand.
Oh, that's a good way.
I tend to have a stronger wing, which is kind of a backup style. And the wing reaches over to the prior and following numbers. So if I'm a 6, I could be a 6 with a 5 wing or a 6 with a 7 wing. And those would influence my basic orientation. So basically, I'm oriented towards a type. And depending upon circumstances, depending upon motivations, stress, all kinds of other elements, I may take on some of the characteristics of my wings. If you want to say they lift me up, and some are stronger than the other. Usually, one arm is stronger than the other. So from that way, that I tend to lean more in one direction than the other.
So I read another book about Enneagram a couple years ago that was recommended to me, The Road Back to You. I think it's by Ian Morgan Cron and Susan Stabile. That's another popular book on this topic, and it was interesting because I was in discussion with my sister about our types, and we are two different people, very distinct different people, but we had the same type. And I'm like, what? Wow. But she had a different wing than I did. And that kind of explained how we could be the same type, but very still different personalities.
Going back to the book here for a moment, I did like the section she had on family, where she points out that we choose our mates, we choose our friends, but we don't choose our family. Yet how we relate to the members of our family is critically important. And some would use the term injuries or other ways of saying in childhood, we're wounded, we're hurt, the experiences we have, we suffer through that. It makes us who we are. And how we relate to our parents, how we relate to our siblings, has a tremendous impact on what type we become and how we act out. So, and again, because of the early stages, it's so formative, impressive, and because I don't choose them, okay, I don't have the control. So learning about myself, learning what those experiences became within me, I can now say, well, I can say I'm screwed up now because I okay, or I'm healthy now because of this.
Yeah.
But what do I do with it? And again, so it's a self observation, self learning, and accepting and improving. I put it in those 3 categories, and I think the authors do a good job of.
And it's a readable book, and it's not too big. It's, I think, a good introduction to this topic. If you've not ever been introduced or heard of the Enneagram, this might be a good place to start. But I do agree that to get the benefit of it, you've got to go a little deeper. Yeah. And work with it. You're talking about your childhood experience, not yours, but childhood experiences. And we read a book by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry called "What Happened to You," which talks about that concept as well. As there's things that happen to us that cause us to become who we are, and that self-awareness, because a lot of times that's repressed and you don't know it. So that's part of the self-discovery process too. Yeah. Well, any other good for the cause, or I'm Eleanor Russell at 360health4u.com, and I like to talk about nutritional support for a healthy body and making healthy happen. So you can reach me at 360health4u.com.
And I'll say one last thing about the book, The Modern Enneagram, is that towards the back they have recognizing and changing bad habits, and have a little section on each type. So we've been talking a lot about habits in the books we're reading lately, so I think that ties in nicely. And I am Kristen Norton, one of the registered dietitians at Well Balanced Nutrition. Visit us at wellbalancednutrition.com. In May, we're talking about mindfulness, and we'd love for you to join our free workshop and sign up for a free consult if you think working with us would be a good fit.
And I want to take a special thank you to Bob Carr, for taking time out of your day to join us in the podcasting studio at such and such.
Yes, thank you.
And really, really appreciate your insight on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen.
Views and opinions stated in this podcast are solely those of the contributors and are not necessarily those of our distributors or hosting company. This podcast is copyrighted, and no part can be reproduced without the expressed written consent of Kristen and Eleanor.